Now let us settle in together and journey back to an ancient time, to a small town called Zarephath, where a miracle unfolded that would echo through the ages. The sun blazed mercilessly over the land of Israel, its rays beating down upon cracked earth and withered fields. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen from the brass-colored sky. The rivers had dwindled to dusty beds lined with sun-bleached stones, and the wells that once bubbled with fresh water now echoed hollow when a stone was dropped into their depths. This terrible drought was no accident of nature. It was the judgment of the Almighty God upon a nation that had turned away from him. King Ahab, weak and easily swayed, had married the pagan princess Jezebel, and together they had led Israel into the worship of false gods. Baal, the supposed god of rain and fertility, and Asherah, the goddess of the sea. Golden calves and wooden idols dotted the landscape, where altars to the true God once stood. Into this spiritual darkness had stepped a man unlike any other, Elijah the Tishbite, a prophet wrapped in rough camel's hair, his eyes blazing with the fire of divine purpose. He had confronted King Ahab with words that still rang in the air. "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except at my word." For months after delivering this pronouncement, Elijah had hidden by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan River. There, in that secret place, ravens, those dark messengers of the wilderness, brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, while he drank from the brook's clear waters. It was a time of solitude and communion with God, but even this sanctuary could not last forever. Day by day, Elijah watched the brook grow shallower. The musical babbling that had once lulled him to sleep grew quieter until it was barely a whisper. Soon only scattered puddles remained, then mere dampness in the sand, and finally nothing but a dry bed where life-giving water had once flowed. It was then, when human resources failed and earthly security vanished, that the word of the Lord came to Elijah again. "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." Zarephath. The name meant a place of refining, and how fitting it would prove to be. This small Phoenician town, nestled along the Mediterranean coast north of Israel, was under Gentile rule. Beyond the borders of the chosen people, in a land where Baal and Asherah were worshipped openly. Yet it was here, in this unlikely place, that God would work one of his most tender miracles. So Elijah gathered his simple possessions, his mantle, his staff, and the unwavering faith that had sustained him through these years of drought and hiding. The sun was high as he began his journey northward, his feet raising small clouds of dust from the parched earth. Behind him lay the dried brook and the memories of miraculous provision. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the promise of God's continued care. As he walked, Elijah might have pondered the strangeness of God's ways. Here was a Hebrew prophet, a man who had proclaimed judgment upon Israel for their worship of foreign gods, now being sent to a foreign land where those very gods were revered. Yet if the years had taught him anything, it was that the Lord's thoughts were higher than his thoughts, and the Lord's ways past finding out. The journey from the Jordan Valley to the coastal region of Zarephath would take several days. Elijah traveled through landscapes scarred by drought, abandoned villages where the wells had run dry, fields where the stubble of failed crops crunched beneath his sandals, and hillsides where olive trees stretched their gnarled branches skyward in silent supplication for rain that would not come. At night he slept under stars that seemed to burn with unusual intensity in the clear, dry air. The moon, when it appeared, cast sharp shadows on the lifeless landscape, and sometimes he could hear in the distance the mournful cry of jackals searching for water in the empty wadis. But even as the physical landscape spoke of judgment and desolation, Elijah's heart remained anchored in hope. The same God who had sent ravens to feed him, who had made water spring from rock for Moses, who had provided manna in the wilderness for the children of Israel, had promised that a widow in Zarephath would care for him. It seemed impossible, even absurd. What widow in this time of famine would have enough to share? Yet Elijah had learned that impossibility was often the very stage upon which God chose to display his glory. On the third day of his journey, the scent of the sea began to reach his nostrils, carried on breezes that offered little relief from the heat, but spoke of his approaching destination. The landscape gradually changed from the brown hills of inland Palestine to the terraced slopes that descended toward the Mediterranean coast. In the distance, he could see the blue expanse of the Great Sea, its surface shimmering like hammered metal under the relentless sun. As he crested the final hill before Zarephath, Elijah paused to survey the town spread below him. It was modest in size, its flat-roofed houses clustered around a small marketplace, with narrow streets winding between them like tributaries of a dry river. The town's walls, though not as grand as those of the great cities, spoke of a community that had weathered many storms. Fishing boats lay pulled up on the beach, their nets spread out to dry. Though in these days of little rain, even the sea seemed less generous with its bounty. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, a sign that even here, far from Israel, the effects of the drought were being felt. Fuel was precious when every piece of wood might be needed for cooking what little food remained, and families were learning to make do with cold meals and carefully rationed provisions. As Elijah descended the hill toward the town gate, his stomach reminded him that it had been hours since his last meal. The ravens no longer came with their mysterious daily provision, and the bread in his traveling pouch was long since consumed. For the first time in months, the prophet experienced the gnawing uncertainty that had become the constant companion of countless families throughout the region. But even as hunger and weariness pressed upon him, Elijah's step remained steady. Somewhere in this foreign town was a widow whom God had prepared to be his instrument of provision. The prophet did not know her name, her face, or her circumstances. He knew only that the Lord had spoken, and that was enough. The sun was now approaching its zenith as Elijah neared the gates of Zarephath, his shadow a small dark pool at his feet. Soon, very soon, he would meet the woman through whom God intended to demonstrate that his care extends beyond all human boundaries, his provision beyond all human understanding, and his power beyond even the finality of death itself. The stage was set for a miracle that would begin with a simple request for water and a piece of bread, but would culminate in wonders that neither the prophet nor the widow could have imagined. In this place of refining, and in this encounter between a Hebrew man of God and a Gentile woman of faith, the character of the Almighty would be revealed in ways both tender and magnificent. The gates of Zarephath stood open in the midday heat, their wooden beams weathered and worn by countless seasons of sun and storm. As Elijah approached, he could see that the usual bustle of a town entrance was notably absent. No merchants haggled over goods, no children played in the dust, no elders sat in the shade, discussing the affairs of the day. The drought and its accompanying famine had drained the life from this place, leaving behind only the essential movements of survival. Elijah's throat was parched from his long journey, and his lips were cracked from the dry air. Each step sent small puffs of dust up from the hard-packed earth, and the prophet found himself scanning the area hopefully for any sign of a well or fountain. His eyes, accustomed to the blazing light of the Palestinian sun, squinted as he tried to make out the details of his surroundings. It was then that he noticed her. Just outside the town gates, near a grove of scraggly olive trees that had somehow managed to survive the prolonged drought, a woman was bent over, methodically gathering fallen sticks and dead branches. Her movements were slow and deliberate, speaking not of laziness, but of the careful conservation of energy that comes from prolonged hunger. Her clothing, once perhaps a deep blue or brown, had faded to the nondescript color of dust and wear, patched in several places with fabric that didn't quite match. As Elijah drew closer, he could see that she was neither young nor old, but somewhere in that middle season of life, where a woman's beauty becomes less about the freshness of youth and more about the character etched in her features by joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray that spoke of hardship born before its time, was partially covered by a worn headscarf that had slipped back as she worked. There was something in her posture, a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion, that made Elijah's heart stir with compassion. This was a woman who had carried burdens, who had made hard choices, who had watched her resources dwindle day by day until she was reduced to gathering sticks in the heat of the day. The prophet paused for a moment, studying her face as she worked. In her features, he could read the story of the drought's impact on ordinary people. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes shadowed with the particular kind of worry that comes from watching a child grow thin. Yet there was also a quiet dignity about her, a refusal to surrender to despair, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. "Excuse me," Elijah called softly, his voice rough from thirst and travel. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the appearance of this stranger. His rough clothing, his weathered features, the staff in his hand that marked him as a traveler from far away. In her gaze, Elijah could see the weariness that had become second nature to people in these hard times. Strangers might bring news, trade, or help, but they might also bring additional mouths to feed when food was already desperately scarce. "Please," Elijah continued, his manner gentle and respectful, "could you bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink?" The request hung in the air between them. Water in this time of drought was precious beyond measure. Every drop had to be carried from wells that were increasingly distant and depleted. Yet something in the prophet's manner, perhaps the genuine need in his voice, or the courtesy with which he had made his request, caused the woman to hesitate rather than refuse outright. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his character and his features. What she saw there must have reassured her, for she slowly straightened, her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms. "I will bring you water," she said simply, her voice carrying the accent of this coastal region, but also a warmth that suggested a heart not yet hardened by suffering. As she turned toward the town, Elijah felt a stirring of gratitude here in this foreign place. This Gentile woman was willing to share her precious water with a Hebrew stranger. It was a small act of kindness, but in a world grown harsh with want, small kindnesses took on the weight of great acts of mercy. But the Lord had sent him here for more than water, and Elijah knew that his true test, and hers, was yet to come. "Wait," he called gently as she began to walk away, "and please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." The woman stopped as if struck. She turned back to him, and now her face bore an expression of such profound sadness that Elijah felt his heart constrict. The weariness he had noticed before was nothing compared to the look of desperate finality that now clouded her features. "As the Lord your God lives," she replied, and there was no anger in her voice, only a crushing weariness and the terrible honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose. I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. See, I am gathering a couple of sticks, that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words fell between them like stones dropping into a deep well. This was not the casual refusal of someone unwilling to share, nor the calculated response of someone hoarding resources. This was the stark reality of a mother who had come to the end of all earthly hope, who had measured her remaining provisions with the careful precision of someone planning a final meal. Elijah felt the weight of her despair, but he also felt the stirring of something else, the peculiar lifting of spirit that came when he sensed the Lord was about to move in power. How often had he seen this pattern? The moment when human resources failed completely was precisely the moment when divine intervention began. "Do not fear," he said, and his voice carried a new authority, a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own understanding. The words were not merely a comfort, but a command, spoken with the certainty of someone who had learned to recognize the voice of the Almighty. The woman's eyes widened at the change in his tone. Something had shifted in the stranger's demeanor, as if he had suddenly remembered who he was and whom he served. "Go and do as you have said," Elijah continued, "but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son." The request seemed almost cruel in its audacity. Here was a woman who had just confessed that she and her child were preparing to eat their last meal before death. And this stranger was asking her to give him the first portion. By any human standard of fairness or compassion, the request was outrageous. But Elijah was not speaking from human wisdom. Now he was speaking as one who had learned to see beyond the visible, to understand that sometimes the pathway to blessing required actions that seemed to defy common sense. "For thus says the Lord God of Israel," he proclaimed, and now his voice carried the full weight of prophetic authority. "The bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." The promise hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. On one side stood the widow's desperate reality: empty bins, empty jars, and the approaching specter of death. On the other side stood the word of a God she barely knew, spoken through a stranger whose only credentials were the conviction in his voice and the authority with which he spoke. The woman stared at him, her mind undoubtedly racing. Everything in her experience told her that flour and oil, once consumed, were gone forever. Everything she had learned about the world spoke against the possibility of vessels that never emptied, and of resources that renewed themselves. She had no reason to trust this foreigner, no evidence that his God was any more real or powerful than the gods her neighbors worshipped. Yet something in his eyes, something in the absolute certainty with which he had spoken, gave her pause. She had lived long enough to recognize truth when she heard it, even when that truth seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about the world. The choice before her was stark and simple, yet it carried implications that reached far beyond the immediate moment. She could refuse, clinging to what little she had, and eat her final meal with her son in the privacy of her own home. Or she could trust, stepping out in faith toward a promise that seemed too wonderful to believe, risking the immediate needs of her child on the word of a stranger's God. As she stood there in the dusty street of Zarephath, with her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms, and the prophet's words echoing in her mind, the widow found herself at one of those crossroads that define a life. Her next decision would determine not only whether she and her son lived or died, but whether they would become part of a story that would be told for generations to come, a story of faith rewarded, of divine provision, and of the God who sees beyond the boundaries that divide nations and peoples. The sun beat down upon them both as she weighed her choice. But in that moment of decision, neither the heat nor the hunger nor the desperate circumstances seemed to matter. All that mattered was whether she would choose to believe that the impossible might just possibly be true. The widow stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, though in reality it was perhaps only the span of a few heartbeats. In that suspended moment, the entire universe seemed to be waiting for her decision. The very air around them felt charged with possibility, as if creation itself was holding its breath to see whether faith would triumph over fear, whether hope would overcome the stark mathematics of survival. Elijah watched her face carefully, seeing the battle that raged within her soul. He had delivered the word of the Lord as he had been commanded, but now the choice was hers alone to make. The prophet knew from long experience that God's miracles often hinged not on human understanding, but on human obedience, not on the ability to see how a promise might be fulfilled, but on the willingness to act as if it already had been. The woman's eyes moved from Elijah's face to the bundle of sticks in her arms, then toward the town gates where her small home awaited, where her son was undoubtedly waiting for her return, probably listening for the sound of her footsteps that would signal the beginning of their final meal together. She thought of his thin face, his two bright eyes that spoke of a child who had learned too young what it meant to be hungry, and her heart clenched with the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. Yet something else stirred within her as well, a memory perhaps of stories she had heard as a child about the God of the Hebrews, the one who was said to part seas and rain bread from heaven. Or perhaps it was simpler than that, nothing more than the recognition that she'd already lost everything that could be lost. And in that place of complete surrender, there was a strange kind of freedom. "I will do as you have said," she whispered finally, her voice so quiet that Elijah had to lean forward to hear her words. The decision, once made, seemed to infuse her with new energy. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her grip on the bundle of sticks, and began walking toward the town gates with a purpose that had been absent from her movements before. Elijah followed at a respectful distance, marveling at the courage it must have taken for her to choose trust over terror, faith over the apparent facts of her situation. The narrow streets of Zarephath were largely empty in the heat of midday, but the few people they encountered looked at the odd pair with curiosity. The widow, known to her neighbors as a woman facing starvation, was walking with determined steps beside a foreign stranger whose very presence seemed to radiate an unusual intensity. Word would spread quickly through the small community that something unusual was happening at the house of the widow woman. Her home, when they reached it, was modest, even by the standards of a fishing town. The flat-roof dwelling was built of the local stone, its walls weathered by countless seasons of Mediterranean storms. A small courtyard in front contained an outdoor oven that had seen little use in recent weeks, its stones cold and covered with a fine layer of dust. A few clay pots stood in the shade, and a wooden door, worn smooth by years of use, that led into the main room of the house. As they approached, the door opened, and a boy appeared, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and hair. His frame was thin in the way that spoke of prolonged hunger, but his face lit up with genuine joy at seeing his mother return. That joy dimmed slightly as he noticed a stranger accompanying her, replaced by the cautious curiosity of a child who had learned to be wary of unexpected changes in routine. "Mother?" he said, his voice carrying a question that encompassed much more than the single word could express. The widow reached out and touched her son's face gently, a gesture that spoke of infinite tenderness and perhaps also a farewell. "This is Elijah, a prophet of the Lord God of Israel," she said simply. "We're going to prepare food, and he will eat with us." The boy's eyes widened. In their current circumstances, sharing food with anyone, even a guest, represented an act of generosity that bordered on the impossible. Yet he had learned to trust his mother's judgment, and if she said this man would eat with them, then somehow it would be so. Inside, the house was cool and dim, a welcome relief from the blazing heat outside. The main room served as both a living area and kitchen, with sleeping quarters in a small adjoining chamber. Clay storage jars lined one wall, most of them standing empty like silent witnesses to the family's dwindling resources. Only two containers held anything of value: a small bin that contained the handful of flour the widow had mentioned, and an equally small jar that held the last precious drops of oil. The widow set down her bundle of sticks and began the familiar ritual of preparing a fire. She arranged the wood carefully in the outdoor oven, knowing that every stick must count, every flame must serve its purpose. As she worked, Elijah and the boy watched in respectful silence, each lost in his own thoughts about what was about to unfold. When the fire was burning steadily, the widow went to retrieve her flour and oil. She opened the bin and looked inside, seeing the meager handful of grain that represented all that stood between her family and starvation. For a moment, her resolve wavered. The practical voice of experience whispered that she was being foolish, that she was about to sacrifice her child's last meal on the word of a stranger. But then she remembered the authority in Elijah's voice when he had spoken his promise, the absolute certainty that had rung in his words like a bell struck in clear mountain air. She had heard many people speak in her lifetime: merchants making promises they wouldn't keep, neighbors offering help they couldn't deliver, officials making proclamations that meant nothing. This had been different. This had carried the weight of truth spoken by someone who knew the one who held the universe in his hands. With steady hands, she measured out the flour, not all of it, but enough to make a small loaf as Elijah had requested. She added the precious oil, drop by careful drop, then water from their dwindling supply. As she kneaded the dough, she found herself praying to the God of Israel, a God she knew only by reputation, but whom she was now trusting with everything she held dear. The bread baked quickly in the hot oven, filling the small courtyard with an aroma that made all their mouths water and their stomachs clench with longing. When it was finished, golden brown and still steaming, the widow placed it on a wooden plate and carried it to where Elijah sat waiting. "Here," she said simply, offering him the bread that might well be the last her household would ever eat. Elijah received the loaf with the gravity it deserved, understanding that he held in his hands not just food, but an act of faith that would echo through eternity. He broke it carefully, offering portions to both the widow and her son before taking any for himself. The bread was simple fare, coarse flour baked with skill born of necessity, but it tasted like the finest feast to three people who had known real hunger. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled over the small courtyard. The bread satisfied their immediate hunger, but more than that, it seemed to nourish something deeper, hope perhaps, or the peculiar peace that comes from taking a step of faith and finding solid ground beneath one's feet. When the meal was finished, the inevitable moment arrived. The widow rose to check her storage containers, knowing that according to every law of nature and economy, they should now be empty. The flour bin should contain nothing but dust and remnants, the oil jar nothing but the stained clay at its bottom. She opened the flour bin first, and her breath caught in her throat. Where she had expected to find emptiness, there was flour, not the handful that had remained before, but the same amount that had been there that morning. Her hands trembled as she reached into the bin, running the grain through her fingers to assure herself that she was not dreaming. Next came the oil jar. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight, hearing the liquid slosh against the sides. It was full, as full as it had been when she had first measured out the precious oil for their bread. "Mother," her son whispered, seeing the wonder and disbelief that played across her features. "The word of the Lord is true," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "The flour and oil have not diminished. They're just as they were before." From that day forward, the miracle continued. Each morning, the widow would wake expecting to find her containers empty, only to discover them filled with the same amounts they had held the day before. She would measure out flour for the day's bread, pour oil for cooking, and use what was needed to sustain her household and their guests. But each time she checked, morning, noon, and evening, the levels remained constant, as if invisible hands were replenishing what had been taken. Word of the miracle spread slowly through Zarephath. Neighbors who had expected to attend a funeral instead saw smoke rising daily from the widow's oven. They saw the boy playing in the courtyard with more energy than he had shown in months. They saw the foreign prophet living in their midst, his presence somehow bringing blessing rather than burden to the household that sheltered him. Some whispered that it was sorcery, others that the gods were showing favor to the widow for her kindness to strangers. But the widow herself knew better. She had witnessed firsthand the power of the God of Israel, the one who could multiply resources that seemed exhausted, who could bring abundance from scarcity, who could sustain life when death seemed certain. As weeks turned into months, the relationship between the widow, her son, and Elijah deepened into something like family. The prophet helped with daily tasks, told stories of his journeys and the wonders he had witnessed, and taught them both about the nature and character of the God he served. The boy, who had never known a father's presence, began to look up to Elijah with the mixture of respect and affection that a son shows to a beloved elder. For his part, Elijah found in this simple household something he had rarely experienced in his years of prophetic ministry: the warmth of ordinary human fellowship. Here, far from the palaces and temples where he usually delivered his messages, he discovered the profound joy of seeing God's love expressed through daily provision, through the laughter of a child who was no longer hungry, through the grateful smile of a woman who had learned to trust in the impossible. The jar and jug that never emptied became more than just a miracle of physical provision. They became symbols of a deeper truth, that the God of Israel was not limited by human boundaries, that his love extended beyond the chosen people to encompass all who would trust in him, that his power was sufficient to meet every need of those who placed their faith in his promises. In the small house in Zarephath, as the drought continued to devastate the surrounding lands, a different kind of abundance flourished. It was an abundance measured not just in flour and oil, but in faith rewarded, hope restored, and the quiet joy of lives sustained by the inexhaustible love of the Almighty. The seasons had begun to change in the way they do even during the harshest droughts, with subtle shifts in the angle of sunlight and the patterns of wind that speak to those who know how to listen. Elijah had now been living in the widow's household for many months, and what had begun as a desperate act of faith had settled into a rhythm of daily miracle. Each morning brought the same wonder: jars that should have been empty, filled with provision, hope renewed with the rising of the sun. The boy had grown stronger during this time, his cheeks regaining some of their childhood roundness, his eyes bright with the vitality that comes from adequate nourishment. He had become Elijah's shadow, an eager student, hanging on every word the prophet spoke about the wonders of God, helping with small tasks around the house, and bringing a lightness to their days that reminded all of them what joy looked like. His laughter had become one of the most precious sounds in that small courtyard, pure and musical, the kind of laughter that makes adults remember what it felt like to see the world as a place of infinite possibility. When he played with the wooden toys he had carved under Elijah's guidance, when he helped his mother tend their small herb garden, when he sat listening to stories of lions' dens and burning bushes, the boy radiated the particular happiness of a child who knows he is loved and secure. The widow, too, had blossomed during these months of miraculous provision. The constant worry that had carved lines around her eyes had softened, it replaced by a quiet confidence that spoke of faith tested and proven true. She had learned to trust not just in the daily renewal of flour and oil, but in the character of the God who provided them. Her relationship with Elijah had evolved from desperate gratitude to genuine friendship, seasoned with the deep respect she held for his calling and his God. In the evenings, when the heat of the day had passed, the three of them would often sit together in the courtyard, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky. Elijah would tell them stories of his people's history, of Abraham's faith, of Moses' courage, of David's psalms, and gradually the widow and her son came to understand that they were not merely recipients of divine charity, but participants in a story much larger than themselves. It was during one of these peaceful evening conversations that the boy first began to cough. At first it seemed like nothing, perhaps a bit of dust in the throat or the dry air that had been their constant companion throughout the drought. The widow offered him water, and he drank gratefully, the coughing subsiding as quickly as it had begun. They thought nothing more of it and continued their conversation about the time when Elijah had called down fire from heaven to consume a sacrifice on Mount Carmel. But the next morning the boy woke with a flush in his cheeks that spoke of fever rather than health. His mother noticed immediately, the way mothers always do, and pressed her palm to his forehead with the practiced concern of one who had nursed many childhood illnesses. He was warm, not dangerously so, but enough to cause worry. And it's nothing serious, she assured Elijah, when she saw the concern in the prophet's eyes. Children often take fevers during the changing of seasons. I have herbs that will help, and with rest he'll be well in a few days. Elijah nodded, but something in his spirit was troubled. He had learned over his years of walking with God to pay attention to such stirrings, even when they seemed to contradict the evidence of his natural senses. Still, he kept his concerns to himself and joined the widow in tending to the boy with all the skill and care they could muster. For 2 days, the illness seemed manageable. The boy remained in bed, accepting the herbal teas his mother prepared, sleeping more than usual, but still able to sit up and take some nourishment. His fever rose and fell in the typical pattern of childhood ailments, and there were moments when he seemed almost his normal self, asking Elijah to tell him again about the ravens that had brought bread and meat to the brook Cherith. But on the third morning, something changed. The boy's breathing became labored, and his fever spiked higher than before. His eyes, when he managed to open them, seemed to look through rather than at the people who bent over him with growing concern. The flush in his cheeks deepened to an alarming red, and his small body trembled with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. The widow worked with desperate efficiency, trying every remedy she knew. She brewed stronger teas from the herbs that had always worked before, applied cool cloths to bring down the fever, and held her son close when the chills made him shake uncontrollably. But despite all her efforts, his condition continued to deteriorate. Elijah found himself in a terrible position. He was a prophet accustomed to speaking with divine authority about the will of God. Yet here he felt helpless in the face of a child suffering. He prayed earnestly, seeking guidance, seeking healing, seeking any word from the Lord about what was happening and why. But the heavens seemed silent, offering no immediate answer to his urgent petitions. By the fourth day, the boy could barely keep his eyes open. His breathing had become so shallow that both his mother and Elijah found themselves leaning close just to assure themselves that he was still alive. The widow had not slept in 2 nights, maintaining a constant vigil beside her son's bed, and the strain was beginning to show in every line of her face. Or perhaps, she said to Elijah during one of the boy's brief periods of peaceful sleep, perhaps we should send for the physician from the next town. I know we have little to pay him with, but surely the physician has no more power over this illness than we do? Elijah replied gently. This is not a sickness that earthly medicine can cure. The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to fully acknowledge. If earthly medicine could not help, if the herbs and treatments that had always worked before were proving useless, then they were facing something beyond the normal course of illness and recovery. They were facing the possibility that God might be calling this beloved child home. On the 5th morning, as the sun rose with its customary indifference to human suffering, the inevitable happened. The widow, who had dozed fitfully in her chair beside the bed, was awakened by a silence that was somehow more alarming than any sound could have been. She looked at her son and knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. His face, which had been flushed with fever, was now pale and still. His chest no longer rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. The boy was gone. The widow's scream of anguish pierced the morning air, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of hope itself. She gathered her son's lifeless body into her arms, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. "What have you done to me, O man of God?" she cried, turning to Elijah with eyes blazing with grief and accusation. "Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" The words struck Elijah like physical blows. Here was a woman who had trusted him, who had shared her last meal based on his promise, who had opened her home to him for months. And now, in the presence of God's prophet, her only child lay dead. Without a word, Elijah gently took the boy from his mother's arms. "Give me your son," he said quietly. And despite her grief, something in his tone made her release her hold on the child. Elijah carried the boy to the upper room where he had been staying, laying him carefully on the bed. Then he fell upon his face before God, crying out with all the passion of his prophetic calling. "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son?" 3 times Elijah stretched himself upon the child, calling out each time, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, like the first breath of dawn after the longest night, the boy's chest rose. His eyes fluttered open, clear and bright, and he looked up at Elijah with wonder. "Teacher," he whispered, his voice weak, but unmistakably alive. Elijah gathered the boy in his arms, his own eyes wet with tears of joy and gratitude. "Come," he said, "let us go to your mother." When the widow saw her son walking down the stairs, alive and whole, she fell to her knees. "Now by this I know that you are a man of God," she declared through her tears, "to learn that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." The miracle at Zarephath teaches us profound truths that echo through the ages. First, we learn about faith in scarcity, how the widow trusted God's promise even when her cupboards were bare and death seemed certain. Her willingness to give from her need, rather than her abundance, shows us that God often asks us to step forward in faith before we can see how he will provide. Second, we see the power of obedience before understanding. The widow didn't need to comprehend how flour and oil could multiply. She simply needed to trust the word of the Lord and act upon it. Blessings flowed not because she understood the miracle, but because she believed in the one who promised it. Third, this story reveals God's care beyond all boundaries. Here was a Hebrew prophet ministered to by a Gentile widow, showing that God's love transcends nationality, culture, and religion. The miracle in Zarephath foreshadowed the day when God's salvation would be offered to all nations. Finally, through Elijah's intercession for the dead boy, we glimpse God's ultimate power over life and death itself. This miracle points forward to the resurrection hope that would one day be fully revealed in Christ, reminding us that with God, even death is not the final word. As our story draws to a close, I invite you to consider the empty jars in your own life. Those places where resources seem exhausted, where hope feels depleted, where you wonder if God sees your need. The widow of Zarephath discovered that the God of impossible things delights in filling what appears empty, and in multiplying what seems insufficient, in bringing life where death has reigned. Perhaps tonight, as you prepare for rest, you can release your own impossibilities into his capable hands. Trust that the same God who filled flour jars and oil vessels in ancient Zarephath is still working miracles today, sometimes dramatic and visible, sometimes quiet and hidden, but always rooted in his unchanging love for his children. The sun has set over that ancient town by the sea, and a gentle breeze stirs the olive trees, where a widow once gathered sticks in desperation and found instead a destiny of faith. In that small house, the jars remained full, the boy grew strong, and three hearts learned to trust in the God of endless provision. May you rest tonight knowing that your own story is being written by the same loving hand, and that tomorrow's provision is already prepared by the one who never fails to keep his promises. Sleep well, dear friend, and remember, with God, the jar never truly empties, and hope is always renewable. Reflection. There are moments in life when everything seems to come to a halt, not because the world has stopped turning, but because something inside of us has run dry. Hope runs dry, strength runs dry. Even the quiet belief that tomorrow might be better than today begins to fade. The widow of Zarephath stood in that very place. This is not a distant story or a symbolic idea, but a real woman, a real mother, looking into the future and seeing nothing but an ending. She had no plan left, no options remaining, nothing else to try. There was only one final meal, a handful of flour, a little oil, a few sticks for a fire, and after that, silence. And yet, it is often in the place where we see an ending that God sees a beginning. This is not easy to accept. We are taught to manage our lives, to prepare, to secure our future, to make sure everything is under control. But this story is not about control. It is about trust when there is nothing left to hold on to. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever stood before an empty jar? A relationship that feels beyond repair, a dream that no longer seems possible, a weariness so deep you no longer know how to pray. You keep going, but inside you know something has quietly faded. The widow did not pretend to be strong. She did not say, I will get through this, or everything will be fine. She spoke the truth. We will eat and then die. It is a heavy statement, but it is also an honest one. And perhaps it is that honesty that opens the door for a miracle. Because God does not work with illusions. He does not require us to pretend or to hide our fear. He asks for one thing, a willingness to trust, even if that trust is small. When Elijah arrived, he did not bring food or a clear solution. He brought only a word that, on the surface, seemed unreasonable. Make me a small cake first. If we are honest, this request feels almost unfair. A mother preparing the last meal for her child is asked to give the first portion to a stranger. No one would blame her if she refused, but this is where the story turns. Faith does not usually appear in comfortable situations. It often emerges in moments that seem to defy logic, not because they are irrational, but because they go beyond what reason alone can understand. And the widow stood between two choices: to hold on to what little remained and face certain loss, or to give it away and trust in what she could not see. This is a tension we all recognize. We cling to what we have because we are afraid to lose it, yet that very grip can prevent us from receiving anything new. Faith always involves a kind of release, a letting go of control, of certainty, of the need to understand everything. It is a movement from I know into I trust. The widow chose to trust, not because she understood, and not because she was certain, but perhaps because she had nothing left to lose. And here we find a quiet paradox. When you have nothing left to lose, you are finally free to trust. Many of us struggle to truly trust, not because we are weak, but because we are still holding on to too much. We hold on to our plans, to our expectations, our sense of how life should unfold. And in doing so, our hands are never open enough to receive what God wants to give. The jar did not overflow in a dramatic moment. There was no sudden burst of light, no thunder from the heavens. Instead, the miracle unfolded quietly. The next day, there was still flour. The day after that, there was still oil. The miracle did not come as an explosion. It came as a rhythm, steady and faithful. This is important because we often look for dramatic change, for instant transformation. But in this story, the miracle is simply this: there was enough for today, not enough for a year, not enough to store away, just enough to keep going. And that teaches us something profound. Faith is not believing that every problem will disappear at once. Faith is trusting that you will be given what you need for each day. You may not yet see the solution, but you are still standing. You may not see the door open, but you are still breathing. You may not see the full light yet, but you have not been abandoned. That too is a miracle. And yet the story does not end there. The child, the widow's only hope, falls ill. This is where the story becomes difficult. Why does pain return after provision? Why does suffering follow a miracle? These are the questions that test faith most deeply. It is easy to trust when everything is going well, but when pain returns, we begin to wonder if we misunderstood or if God is still present at all. The widow did not hide her anguish. She cried out, "Why?" And that question is not wrong. True faith is not the absence of questions. It is the willingness to keep seeking God even when answers do not come immediately. There are moments in life when silence feels heavier than any answer, not the peaceful kind of silence that brings rest, but the kind that presses in on the heart, leaving questions suspended in the air with no reply. This is where the story of the widow deepens. After the miracle of provision, after the quiet faithfulness of daily bread, after the reassurance that God had seen her and sustained her, her son fell ill. And not just ill, but beyond recovery. The child who had been preserved through famine now lay still, and the house that had once been filled with quiet gratitude was suddenly overwhelmed with grief. This is the part of the journey that many do not expect. We often assume that once God begins to move, everything will continue upward. And that blessing will follow blessing without interruption. But life does not always unfold that way. Sometimes, even in the midst of provision, pain returns. Sometimes, even after a miracle, we are faced with loss. And in those moments, the questions become sharper, more urgent, more personal. Where is God now? Why would he allow this? Was the miracle only temporary? The widow did not hide from these questions. She did not soften her words or pretend to understand. She turned to Elijah and spoke out of the depth of her anguish. Her grief was raw, honest, and unfiltered. And this too is part of faith. Faith is not the absence of pain. It is not the denial of sorrow. It is the courage to bring that sorrow fully into the presence of God, even when it feels overwhelming. There is something deeply human and deeply sacred in that kind of honesty. Elijah himself stood in a place of tension. He was a prophet, a man who had seen the power of God, who had spoken with authority and witnessed miracles. Yet here, before the lifeless body of a child, he did not have easy answers. He did not offer explanations or distant comfort. Instead, he did something far more vulnerable. He cried out to God. His prayer was not polished or distant. It was urgent, almost confrontational. He asked why. He pleaded. He stretched himself over the child again and again, as if refusing to accept that death would have the final word. There is something important here. Even those who are closest to God will encounter moments when they do not understand what He is doing. Faith does not eliminate mystery. It does not remove the need to wrestle. In fact, sometimes faith leads us directly into that struggle. But what matters is not that we understand everything. What matters is that we continue to turn toward God rather than away from Him. And then, in a moment that shifts everything, life returns. Not gradually, not symbolically, but truly and fully. The child breathes again. The silence is broken. What had seemed final is reversed. And in that moment, something deeper than provision is revealed. God is not only the one who sustains life day by day, He is also the one who holds power over life and death itself. This miracle is not just about a single child or a single family. It points to a greater truth that echoes far beyond that small house in Zarephath. It reminds us that no situation is beyond the reach of God. What appears final to us is not necessarily final to Him. What feels like an ending may still be part of a larger story that we cannot yet see. But perhaps even more important than the miracle itself is what it reveals about relationship. The widow's understanding of God changes. At first, she knew Him only through provision, through flour and oil that did not run out. But now she sees something more. She sees that His word is not only sufficient for daily needs, but also trustworthy in the deepest places of life and loss. Her faith moves from survival to conviction, from receiving help to recognizing truth. And this is often how faith grows. It begins with small steps, with moments of trust in difficult circumstances. It deepens through experience, through both provision and pain. And over time, it becomes something rooted, something steady, something that can endure even when life feels uncertain. As you reflect on this story, perhaps you can see parts of your own journey within it. There may be areas of your life where you have already seen provision, where something that should have run out somehow continued. There may also be places where you are still waiting, still questioning, still carrying a quiet ache that has not yet been resolved. Both are part of the same journey. You may find yourself in a season of receiving, where each day brings just enough to continue. Or you may find yourself in a season of silence, where answers feel distant and clarity has not yet come. Wherever you are, this story gently reminds us that God is present in both. He is present in the daily provision, and He is present in the unanswered questions. He is present in the quiet faithfulness of ordinary days, and He is present in the moments that shake us to our core. And as the day comes to a close and you prepare to rest, you might consider what you are holding on to. What fears, what burdens, what unanswered questions are weighing on your heart? You do not need to resolve them tonight. You do not need to understand everything. Perhaps it is enough simply to place them, gently and honestly, into God's hands. The same God who sustained a widow with a handful of flour, who met her in her deepest loss, who restored what seemed gone forever, is still at work. Not always in ways we can see, not always on a timeline we would choose, but always with a purpose that reaches beyond our immediate understanding. So tonight, you can rest. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are not alone. Not because every question has been answered, but because the one who holds the answers is still near. And even in the quiet, even in the waiting, even in the places that feel empty, there is a gentle, steady truth that remains. What God begins, he is faithful to complete.